which is to start recording so that who are unable to attend the seminar can listen back to it, because we will put the recordings up with a link from our website to the YouTube channel we've set up. So that being said, I'll hand it over to you, Jess. And if anybody hasn't muted themselves, please do so, apart from Jess, of course.
Yeah.
And you can, if you have a question that requires clarification immediately, you can put that into the chat. Otherwise, we'll have the questions at the end, and they can be done either through chat or through speaking. But we'll do that in about 40 minutes' time. So over to you, Jess.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is based on a chapter that I'm currently writing for an edited volume called Undoing Chineseness, the Cultural Politics of Language and Identity in Globalizing China. So the chapter that I'm writing is going to be called Framing Chineseness and Indonesianness on the Indonesian Periphery. So basically, what this chapter is going to involve is an exploration of the crossroads of Chineseness and Indonesianness through analysis of use of address forms in interactions between Chinese Indonesian youth in a town called Pontianak in West Kalimantan in Indonesia, of course. So before getting into a discussion of the data and analysis, I just wanted to give a little bit of context about the origins of the Chinese populations currently in Indonesia. So the ethnic Chinese have actually existed in the Indonesian archipelago since at least the 13th century, possibly even earlier. And since their arrival in the archipelago, they have actually participated in Indonesian society pretty consistently. They're even part of the independence movement, as you can see evidence of in the image on the right there. This is from a poster that was presented in Indonesian and Chinese that asked Chinese and Indonesian people in Indonesia to unite in order to promote independence, the independence movement in Indonesia at the time. So despite all of this involvement of the Chinese in the nation building in Indonesia, the ethnic Chinese populations have pretty consistently suffered racial vilification throughout their history in the region. So this is particularly severe during the Orde Baru regime, so the New Order regime that began in around in 1966 and continued right up until 1998. So during this time, there were an enormous number of discriminatory policies that were introduced by the government that actively discriminated against the Chinese, and that involved the banning of Chinese language from use in the public sphere. So all of the Chinese news publications and schools were shut down. In addition to that, all expressions of Chinese culture were also prohibited from the public sphere. And this is in large part because Chinese identity, language, and culture was viewed at this time as being antithetical to Indonesian nationalism and considered to degrade unity within the new nation. So Chinese people were encouraged to abandon their Chineseness and assimilate to Indonesian identity. Now, importantly, Indonesian national identity at this time was, and to a certain extent still is, conflated with indigenous PreBumi ethnic identity. And so this meant that in order to assimilate to Indonesian national identity, you needed to assimilate to PreBumi culture to some degree. So again, by doing things like adopting PreBumi names. So the height of anti-Chinese vilification really exploded in May of 1998, as many people probably know. This is when the anti-Chinese riots occurred, during which time at the end or the beginning of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia were blamed for the economic disadvantage of Indonesia, and hence as a result these riots, during which time a lot of Chinese businesses were burnt, a lot of ethnic Chinese Indonesians were murdered, and many Chinese women were raped. So although this is kind of like the kind of darkest point in the history of the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, more recently, since the Reformation era that began in 1998, there has been some revitalization of Chinese language and culture. There's also been some re-sinification that involves Indonesians of Chinese ancestry acquiring Chinese languages. These are, Mandarin most predominantly. However, that being said, the effects of the Orde Baru are still present in Indonesia today. And this is particularly evident in the resurgence of what's called PreBumi narratives. So one of the most kind of important enduring policies and ideologies of the Orde Baru regime was the dichotomy between PreBumi and non-PreBumi. So, of course, this dichotomy didn't actually originate during the Orde Baru regime. It certainly became popularized through political discourse at this time. So basically, the dichotomy distinguishes between PreBumi, or indigenous Indonesians, and non-PreBumi, or non-indigenous Indonesians. So according to the definition, and the definition alone, the non-PreBumi individuals could refer to anyone who is non-indigenous. So that would include Indonesians of Indian, Arab, and Chinese descent. They would all be classed as non-PreBumi. However, in practice, the term non-PreBumi is used almost exclusively in reference to the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, and often in the context of classing them as less Indonesian or non-Indonesian. So although certainly, as I said, this is a really kind of prominent discourse that was emergent during the Orde Baru regime, it's more recently resurged in public discourse. And this has certainly been the case as evidenced in a lot of news reports about Ahok, who is the ex-governor of Jakarta. So a lot of the nativist narratives that I'm speaking about became popularized in media during the 2016 arrest of Ahok, which occurred when Ahok, who is ethnically Chinese and was at the time the governor of Jakarta, was accused of blasphemy after criticizing other politicians' use of verses from the Quran to dissuade Muslim voters from electing non-Muslim leaders. So since this time, Ahok has been arrested, imprisoned, and then later released. But throughout this whole process and prior to his arrest, he had already endured quite an enormous amount of racial vilification that began even in 2012 when he first ran for governor. So basically, these PreBumi narratives really enhance pre-existing discord between the PreBumi native population and non-PreBumi others, so which is again almost always the ethnic Chinese. And a lot of these narratives don't just focus on the contrast between PreBumi and non-PreBumi, but specifically they lay blame on the ethnic Chinese for supposedly hoarding the wealth of the nation to the detriment of the PreBumi natives, who are the rightful owners of the nation, according to, again, this narrative. These narratives are also very much evident in recent public discussion about whether or not the president of Indonesia should be a PreBumi native, and that should be a prerequisite in order to actually run for office. So this is very much kind of still in the public sphere. Now, the obvious kind of consequence of PreBumi narratives is that they characterize Chinese identity as very homogenous, so that everyone who possesses Chinese identity is more or less the same, and that specifically they are forever foreigners who are strongly oriented to the PRC state and incapable of integrating into Indonesian society. And of course, as I said before, in reality, many of the ethnic Chinese have very long lineages in Indonesia, so stretching generations, and they're often from different, their ancestors are actually from different regions in China. So again, it's a very heterogeneous community as well. So basically, like, what's going on here is that there's still a characterization of Chineseness as being antithetical to Indonesianness, and these are some kind of a binary opposition, so that one can either identify as being Indonesian or Chinese, but not both. And this is also represented again in public discussion of things like, for instance, the Chinese New Year celebrations, which I've referenced in this photo here, that were shut down in 2008 in Pontianak after there were complaints from Gerakan Barisan Malay Bersatu, the United Malay Front, who claimed that lion and dragon dancing should be banned because they aren't part of Indonesian culture. So again, you can see there's this kind of perceived binary opposition between Chineseness and Indonesianness. Now, prior research on Chinese communities in Indonesia has shown that the ethnic Chinese diaspora is quite heterogeneous. However, the majority of the studies that have been conducted on Chinese Indonesians have focused on groups in Java. Now, this is a little bit problematic insofar as a lot of research on ethnic Chinese use in this area indicates a certain level of homogeneity between different communities, in indicating that young people no longer identify as being ethnically Chinese and don't practice Chinese culture and typically don't speak Chinese languages. So the kind of uniformity observed in these studies seems to suggest that the Chinese are more homogeneous than they are in reality. Additionally, discussions of young Indonesians becoming Indonesianized and rejecting Chinese language and culture as kind of being foreign reinforce the notion that Chineseness is akin to foreignness. And this is even somewhat embedded in the kind of re-sinification that we've observed in Indonesia, as young Indonesians are more frequently learning Mandarin as an additional language. And this is important because although this might appear as kind of a re-identification with Chinese ancestry, and that may be, you know, to a certain extent the case, a lot of the motivation behind learning languages such as Mandarin is economic. So they kind of view it more as acquiring a foreign kind of trade language rather than acquiring their own languages. So all of this together kind of suggested to me that more research really needed to be conducted on communities outside of Java in order to get a kind of clearer perspective on the diversity within the Chinese diaspora in Indonesia and ways of being Chinese and Indonesian simultaneously. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with Indonesia's geography, you can see in this map of Indonesia here that the early studies of ethnic Chinese were located here, 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 and here. So all pretty close together in Java. Now, the study that I conducted was all the way over here in Pontianak. And the reason why I decided to conduct a research project in Pontianak was for a couple of reasons. So firstly, Pontianak differs from some of the other major cities in Java in several important ways. So firstly, Pontianak plays host to the largest concentration of ethnic Chinese Indonesians in Indonesia. So ethnic Chinese Indonesians in Pontianak make up about 10% of the population, whereas they make up about 2% of the population elsewhere in the archipelago. Additionally, another kind of important difference is that New Order politics that I mentioned earlier didn't seem to have the same effect in Pontianak as they had in some of the larger cities in Java, insofar as a lot of the discriminatory policies that were leveled at ethnic Chinese Indonesians that involve kind of prohibiting the use of Chinese language and expressing Chinese culture weren't as severe in Pontianak. So this meant that a lot of the effects of Indonesianization weren't as severe in Pontianak as they were in other cities. And this is observable insofar as people in Pontianak still speak and have continued to speak Chinese languages throughout their history in the region, whereas those in Jakarta, in Bandung, in Surabaya, typically don't speak their heritage languages anymore. And in terms of identity as well, this is also a pretty significant contrast. For instance, just anecdotally, I can say I observed when I accompanied one of my participants who is Xiaocha Chinese from Pontianak, I accompanied her to visit her cousins in Jakarta. And even though they're exact same family, very similar like history, their ancestors migrated at the same time. However, their cousins in Jakarta don't speak any Chinese languages, don't practice Chinese culture, don't celebrate Imlek, the Chinese New Year. But this participant and her family in Pontianak certainly do. And in fact, their primary language of communication is Chinese language, Xiaoqiao. So this illustrates some of the differences between the Chinese communities that I was really trying to dig into. So more specifically, as I said, all of my research focuses on the ethnic Chinese use of Pontianak in West Kalimantan. So as I said, unlike their counterparts in other cities, the ethnic Chinese in this region certainly do identify as being ethnically Chinese, still practice Chinese culture, and to such an extent that Chinese culture and language is kind of valued really, really highly. So this is to the extent that younger members of the community are kind of expected to use Chinese languages as much as possible, or risk losing their Chineseness and being labeled as Jina Bodo, which means like dumb Chinese. So people that look Chinese but don't practice Chinese culture, don't recognize their Chineseness. This is a really kind of common narrative in Pontianak within the Chinese community. So importantly, just like the ethnic Chinese elsewhere in Indonesia that I've spoken about, these Chinese Indonesians are not recent migrants. Most of them have been 4th, 5th generation Indonesian. So they are certainly Indonesian, but also of Chinese ethnicity. And their linguistic repertoires typically consist of Standard Indonesian, Kek or Teochew Chinese, and Pontianak Malay, which is the local language spoken in the region. So basically what I was doing in Pontianak is I was trying to analyze how Chineseness and Indonesianness are kind of intersecting categories of personhood that's evident through the use of language in interaction to construct Chinese and Indonesian identities and reproduce ideologies and values that are common to these different groups. So the data that I'm going to be talking about today is based on kind of conversational data and interviews that I conducted with students at a college in Pontianak that I've called Pontianak Catholic College. So this is a private college where the student population is predominantly ethnically Chinese, and this is in part because the college is of Christian denomination. And commonly a lot of the ethnic Chinese in this region are Christian. So that's part of the reason why there's a large portion of Chinese enrolled in this particular institution. So what's important about this institution is, and I suppose universities in general in Indonesia, is that in colleges in Indonesia, there's kind of a social hierarchy that positions junior classmen below kind of senior classmen, and this kind of social hierarchy affects students' linguistic practices, including the selection of like forms of address that I'm going to be talking about. So that's just kind of like necessary context in order to understand some of the things that we're talking about regarding the terms of address and how it relates to Chinese and Indonesian ideologies, values, identities, and so on. So as I said, the particular aspect of interaction that I was looking at is the use of forms of address, in particular kinship terminology. So the reason why I wanted to look at this is because previous studies have shown that selection of forms of address, or none at all, can have pretty wide-ranging consequences for social dynamics in Indonesia. So the speaker's choice of forms of address can communicate pretty important information about the relationship between interlocutors, their rights and obligations, as well as their roles in discourse as well. So for instance, asymmetric kin term address can reproduce during social relations that have to do with respect and deference, whereas reciprocal second person singular pronominal address typically reproduces social sameness. So kinship terminology in particular is especially loaded with ideological significance. And this is because oftentimes people can use kinship terms to draw on family relations and connected ideologies, cultural values and identities that position members of the community as kind of distinct from wider society. And this is particularly the case within minority communities. So if we actually have a look at the kin terms that are available to Chinese Indonesians in Pontianak, you can see that there are different sets of kin terms available in Standard Indonesian, Pontianak Malay, and Kek and Teochew Chinese. So importantly, if you look at the kin terms I've listed here, moving between different sets of kin terms in different languages doesn't involve just some simple act of just directly translating a term in one language to an equivalent term in another. Particularly if we kind of contrast the kin terms in Indonesian and Pontianak Malay with those in Chinese. So you'll see that there are some notable differences between the Chinese kin term system and those of Indonesian languages. So firstly, the Chinese kin term system features two sets of terms of address used to address relatives from the maternal and paternal sides of the family. So this doesn't exist in the Indonesian kin term system. And additionally, the Chinese kinship term system also differs from other Indonesian systems because it marks the age of individuals relative to one's immediate family. So for instance, you can see here in this list of Kek Chinese kin terms, or E refers to auntie, but specifically an auntie that is older than one's mother. So it's a different term if you're referring to an auntie who's younger than one's mother. Similarly, the term acek, for instance, refers to the younger brother of one's father, whereas apek refers to the older brother of one's father in Teochew Chinese. So basically what happens is Chinese speakers employ the kin terms to address non-kin, typically, by first assessing kind of the age, gender, and ethnicity of their interlocutor. And once they've kind of judged this information, they can select a kin term that best befits this assessment. So due to the complexity of the Chinese kinship system and its difference from that of Indonesian and Malay languages, having knowledge of the appropriate Chinese kin term to use in a given interaction is actually a pretty big deal. So it's a way of showing elders in the community that you're still Chinese. So the reason why I say this is, for instance, a lot of the younger people that I interviewed said that if they use the wrong kinship term with somebody in the community, they would often, get scolded by older members of the Chinese community. So for instance, their grandparents might ask, "Kamu orang apa?" So like, what kind of person are you? So referring to their ethnicity. So this brings me to then discuss, so like you can see that, the kin terms here are certainly quite ideologically loaded. And in part, this comes from the indexicalities of the languages from which these kin terms are derived. So basically, when speakers select forms of address, including kinship terminology, they have to consider not only the indexicalities of the individual forms of address, but also those of the languages from which they come from. So the average linguistic repertoire of young Chinese Indonesians, as I said before, in this region typically involves, the national language, which is Standard Indonesian, one of two ethnic languages, so Kek or Teochew Chinese, as well as Pontianak Malay. And each of these languages plays a role in national and local narratives regarding the functions of different varieties in everyday communication. So, for instance, the use of standard Indonesian kinship terminology can reproduce Indonesian national monologic ideology that basically suggests that Standard Indonesian is the language of the Indonesian nation. It should be used as lingua franca between people who are of different ethnicities or from different regions in Indonesia. And it's a source of kind of unifying identity among all people of Indonesian society. On the other hand, the use of Kek and Teochew kin terms can reproduce Chinese cultural values that suggest that ethnic Chinese individuals should use Chinese languages in interaction with fellow Chinese people. And this is in part kind of product of Indonesian monologic ideology that's kind of positioned Standard Indonesian as the language of the nation and language of Indonesian identity, which means then that all the other languages spoken in Indonesia are repositioned as being regional or ethnic languages, which means, by unintended consequence, that a lot of those regional and ethnic languages become very strongly associated with regional and ethnic identities. Therefore, quite commonly in Pontianak, we talk about Teochew and Kek languages as being very much emblematic of Chinese identity in this particular region. And that means also that they are very much connected to a lot of Chinese values. So, although the ideologies that I've discussed here do appear probably at first glance to be oppositional, research indicates that individual speakers are actually able to draw on both sets of values to navigate between their Chinese and Indonesian identities and even present both simultaneously. And this is what I'm going to get into in a moment. So just to kind of clarify in more detail, you can see here that the three languages that provide the address forms that I'm talking about are actually indexed to different ideologies, communicative contexts, and identities as well. So for instance, Pontianak Malay that I mentioned before is the local language of Pontianak, and it's typically kind of viewed as like an urban vernacular, so a very informal language that you would use in cases where you're speaking to someone that you're really close with, and it's a very informal context, and you're just kind of like playing around. So a lot of my participants would refer to this as a language that they'd use like just for having fun. And it's also kind of indirectly associated with Pontianak and specifically Pontianak ethnic Malay identity. I could say more about this, but I think I'll move on. But basically the point here is that when individuals select forms of address, they of course are drawing on the social meanings that are associated with those forms, but also the social meanings that are associated with the languages from which the forms are derived. So there's kind of all of these layers of meaning that are reproduced through the selection of forms of address in different languages and discourse. So the way in which I'm analysing the reproduction of these enduring social meanings is through a combination of indexicality, particularly Manning's discussion of enduring and spatially based indexicality, as well as Blommaert and Defina's chronotypic frame theory that I'll talk about in a moment. So indexicality, so the relationship between form and social meaning, exists on a spectrum from concrete to spatially based indexicality, according to Manning. So basically this means that in addition to situationally emergent social meaning, there's also social meaning that's derived through reference to historic use of a form. So this means that there can also be not just kind of interactional meanings that emerge just within a given interaction, but also kind of more perduring social relations between forms and meanings in society that can emerge through repeated use of a form in a particular circumstance to convey the same meanings. That means that every time the form is then used thereafter, even across various circumstances, the same social relations may be perceived. So as an example, we can say that the Jakarta first-person singular pronoun gue, for instance, has been noted to have perduring social meanings of tough, outspoken Jakartan identity, according to Jenner, Ewing, and Mans. So although these kind of social meanings do certainly exist beyond an individual interaction, they are still grounded in the interactions within which they're reproduced. But they are kind of, we could say, reproductions of larger cultural concepts that are then kind of negotiated and situated within an individual interaction. So as I said before, in addition to indexicality, I'm also integrating a chronotypic frame approach to the analysis of data here. And the reason why I'm using chronotypic frame theory is because chronotypic frame theory builds on indexicality by illustrating how perduring social meanings associated with linguistic features are brought into interaction and then calibrated against other semiotic resources to frame ongoing talk and configure roles and identities of speakers. So basically what happens is when speakers deploy a linguistic feature to invoke a chronotype of time space, they're drawing on perduring indexicalities of the form that exists within a particular kind of invocable chunk of history, as Blommaert would call it, so that's the chronotype. And these kind of social relations between form and meaning can reproduce and respond to chronotypic frames that influence the interpretation of talk. So basically the reason why I'm using chronotypic frame theory then is basically because indexicality alone doesn't really account for the relationship between perduring and spatially based social meaning. So that means that although there's some acknowledgement in the literature of a fluid relationship between meaning that's emergent from interaction and meaning that exists beyond the interaction, they're often presented in actual analysis as kind of two binary perspectives on meaning. So you can either look at meaning as something that emerges from the individual conversation, or you can look at meaning as something that exists in a more abstract sense and that is reproduced within conversation. Chronotypic frame theory, I think, better captures the kind of historic and momentary agency of sociolinguistic work because it explains how the use of a linguistic feature can reproduce historic identities, ideologies, and genres, for instance, and how these kind of invocable histories are then calibrated against other semiotic resources and interaction to produce situationally contingent meanings. This is kind of what Blommaert refers to as the process by which signs of history become signs in history. So that means that perduring and situational social meanings are kind of working together in interaction. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too abstract, but maybe it'll kind of make more sense when you take a look at some of the data that I've got here. So in terms of the patterns of use of forms of address at Pontianak Catholic College, I found that there were kind of two dominant patterns of address relevant to interactions at this institution. So firstly, I noticed that typically first names and second person singular pronouns are most commonly used in interactions between students of the same class who share the same age and rank. Whereas in interactions between students from different classes, lower ranking junior students were expected to use upward oriented kinship terminology as deferential forms of address when speaking with more senior students. So again, I'm looking at all this in the context of specifically Chinese Indonesian students drawing on their linguistic repertoires to select forms of address that reproduce ideologies, values, and identities that are connected to Chineseness and Indonesianness in interaction to show how these identities are intersectional. So as an example of this, you can see this example here, which features an interaction between two Chinese Indonesian students, so Lestari and Hari. So these two students are classmates and close friends, so they sit together in the same class. And you can see that in this interaction, the majority of the interaction is conducted in Teochew Chinese. And throughout the interaction, Lestari and Hari are referring to one another using the Chinese second person pronoun le. So the reciprocal exchange of the second person singular pronoun here is the most common form of address observed in interactions between intimate friends and classmates at Pontianak Catholic College. And the choice of the second person pronoun is certainly not random because it's informed by the chronotypic frames of interaction that influence and are influenced by the speech situations and the social actions of speakers. So in this case, the close relationship between the speakers and the content of talk, so being quite intimate and personal, so talking about relationship that Hari has with Birnie that's inferred at the end here. All of this is kind of consistent with the context in which we would typically see use of reciprocal second person singular pronouns. Now the fact that they've chosen a Teochew pronoun to respond to these chronotypic frames is important because it's invoking chronotypes of social parity that are drawing on enduring social meanings of social closeness as well as Teochew Chinese identity. So Lestari and Hari share three common languages, so Teochew Chinese, Pontianak Malay, and Standard Indonesian. So they could have selected a number of different second person singular forms of address that convey some level of social parity. However, I'd argue that the reason they selected le to emphasize their social sameness is to emphasize their social sameness, and they're doing this in several different ways. So firstly, the pronoun reproduces a communicative style that the two speakers typically use when interacting privately together. And this is kind of constructing a feeling of like social sameness between the two of them by using the language they typically use to interact again together. But secondly, the use of a Chinese second person singular pronoun replicates the aforementioned cultural values of the Chinese community in Pontianak that include using ethnic Chinese languages as much as possible in interactions with fellow ethnic Chinese people. So Lestari and Hari are kind of indirectly reinforcing their shared identity as ethnic Chinese individuals who adhere to this cultural value. It also distinguishes them from other people in their class as well, insofar as they've got a language that not everyone can access and understand. So therefore the use of le invokes chronotypes that produce layers of social sameness that work together to enhance proximal social alignment between the speakers and reproduces kind of a chronotypic frame for intimate social talk here. So in terms of like the strategic use of pronominal forms of address here, we could say that the reason why they're invoking chronotypes of social sameness and ethnic solidarity and these Chinese values is specifically so that Lestari's sense of solidarity can be exchanged to reduce Hari's inhibitions regarding providing information about his plans with Birnie later. Another example, very different example, involves one of the same speakers here, Lestari, interacting with another ethnic Chinese student, Rana, but in this case they're using terms of address that are drawn from Pontianak Malay. So This is important because not all reciprocal second person singular pronoun use is designed to create solidarity based on speakers' actual identities. So sometimes speakers can use forms of address to perform identities that are not their own and reproduce solidarity relationships with others who are kind of in on the joke. So speakers can draw on enduring associations between a particular form of address and a particular social type to construct a character voice for a humorous effect. So in this case, Lissari is creating a character who engages in some kind of a light sexual harassment, if you like, of Rana in line 1. She addresses her as Cinta. It's a shortening of Pecinta, which means lover. So to construct this character, Lissari uses a second person pronoun kau alongside several phonetic features that are not consistent with her natural accent. So Lissari doesn't use kau in her, Lissari does use kau in her everyday interactions, but the use of the pronoun combined with the realization of the final a in words like cinta and dimana in standard Indonesian as as per cinta dimana is very much typical of Pontianak Malay pronunciation and is not consistent with her normal speech style. So this suggests that Lissari is drawing on a voice that's not her own to construct a character. And this is significant that she's using Pontianak Malay forms to do so, as Pontianak Malay is again associated with coarse informality, vulgarity, and also having fun, as I said before. So it's indirectly indexical as well of masculinity in the Pontianak context. So Lissari is invoking chronotropes, these enduring indexicalities of Pontianak Malay forms of address to engage in this kind of verbal play that reproduces a chronotypic frame of talk between what we might say is, I don't know, like a creepy kind of vulgar male and a young woman that sits in contrast with Lissari's actual identity as a fellow young Chinese Indonesian woman, and this is what creates the kind of humorous effect here. So the point here in these two examples is that in both cases we're seeing reciprocal use of second person pronoun, but it's for different effects because they're drawing on the enduring indexicalities of these different forms. They're connected to, again, enduring indexicalities of these different languages that they are derived from. So this next example illustrates where the kin terms figure into interaction in this context. So you can see in the first line here that a junior student, Dina, is addressing a senior student, again, Lestari, using the upward-oriented Chinese kinship term "che," which is used to refer to older sister. Whereas in response, Lestari is using downward-oriented Malay second-person singular address term kau and kalian. So the asymmetric selection of forms of address is, we can say, is a response to chronotypic frames emerging from the situational context, first and foremost. So Lissari and Dina's conversation is typical of interactions between juniors and seniors that typically center on homework and school activities. And the conversation is also very informal, as evidenced through informal expressions like curhat, which means to pour one's heart out, and sialan, which is like shit. So Dina's selection of che to address Lissari speaks to chronotypic frames for informal talk, as well as chronotypic frames for formal institutional talk that frequently overlap in interactions between senior and junior students. So a response to these chronotypic frames invokes chronotypes of kinship, in particular, respect for seniority, that so drawing on enduring social relationships between the kin terms and intimacy, solidarity, but also deference with seniority. So the upward-oriented kin terms have a kind of enduring connection to respect for elders that's based on deference of junior students for senior students that echoes that of kind of younger siblings for older siblings. So additionally, there's some level of solidarity and intimacy involved in the relationship between the students here that emerges as a result of their shared membership to the same college. So belonging to the same college here is kind of analogous with belonging to the same family, in that they both infer kind of familial intimacy and a shared identity. So hence the upward-oriented kin terms draws on both the cultural concepts of solidarity and deference that speak to both axes of the relationship between the interlocutors. And the selection of Chinese kin terms in place of Indonesian equivalents adds another layer of solidarity and deference that emerges from the enduring association between the forms of address and Chinese cultural values mentioned in the discussion of the first example. Right, so basically you can see here that the selection of the forms of address are kind of like layering together through, invocation of chronotopes of, historic use of these terms, as well as historic use and narratives regarding the languages in which these terms are drawn from. So importantly as well, I wanted to mention that the invocation of chronotopes of this fictive kinship in the college context also functions to invite the study to take on the role of the senior student, so by providing assistance and support to the junior student dinner in this case. And so the study's use of the downward oriented address indicates that she's perhaps taking on this role. But also we could say that the choice of kind of highly informal second person pronominal forms of address in the form of kau and kalian in place of more formal downward oriented kinship terms in Chinese such as lelet also functions to reduce the social distance between the interlocutors without compromising kind of the enduring social relationship between juniors and seniors. So basically, instead of kind of doubling down on the emphasizing the hierarchical difference between the senior and junior students by using the Chinese kinship terms, she's using the Indonesian Malay kinship, Indonesian Malay pronominal forms of address in order to emphasize informality, which again, and using a language that's very much associated with informality and social closeness in order to kind of bridge the gap here. If she were to use the same pronouns in standard Indonesian, so such as kamu, this would be certainly more formal and therefore consistent with some aspects of this interaction, but this language is also associated with social distance and therefore not deemed really appropriate in this context. So again, the selection of specifically Pontianak Malay pronominal forms of address in response to the Chinese kinship term of address in line 3 is importantly socially significant. Okay, so I think I've probably gone on long enough at this point, but basically what I'm trying to say here is that speakers can strategically deploy forms of address to invoke chronotopes of enduring indexicalities of the forms, including identities, ideologies, and values, and bring these into interaction in order to construct their identity relative to their interlocutor and serve discursive goals, so such as trying to emphasize solidarity in exchange for exchange of intimate information, or in order to get an older student, more senior student to help you with your homework or something like that. So although the Chinese and Indonesian ideologies that I mentioned earlier certainly do appear oppositional insofar as one emphasizes the use of Indonesian language in order to index kind of Indonesian national identity and kind of a sense of united shared identity, and the other focuses on the use of Chinese languages as a way of kind of inhibiting the progress of Indonesianization and maintaining Chinese culture, values, and identity. In reality, what I've seen is that certainly speakers are able to draw on kind of both sets of values to navigate between Chinese and Indonesian identities in interaction. So they're kind of both working together here. And we can also see that far from avoiding integration into local communities, as has been claimed in the past, Chinese Indonesians are actually actively engaging with local languages, cultures, and identities, as we can see insofar as the study is reproducing a very locally recognizable identity through the use of the Pontianak Malay accent and the use of Pontianak Malay forms of address when she was joking around with her fellow ethnic Chinese friend Rana in class. So basically what I'm trying to do with this chapter is contribute to the overarching argument of my work that Chinese and Indonesian identities are certainly not mutually exclusive, but more kind of dynamic and certainly mediated in interaction. Okay, I think that's just about it. Hopefully that was moderately clear. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, well, thank you, Jess. That was more than moderately clear as far as I'm concerned, but who would like to start off with questions? There are none in that. There's one from David Detterding in the chat. Do your subjects ever use English pronouns in their speech?
No, not really. Yeah, English isn't really, I mean, all of my students are actually enrolled in English classes, so they do speak some level of English, but they don't really use it amongst themselves. So no, I haven't really seen it. The only situation in which I've actually seen them use English pronouns is on social media.
David, you want to follow that up, or does someone else have a question or a comment? People can. So there's a question here from James. I'm still a bit unclear about how chronotypes differ from indexicality and to what extent they both to the ethnography of communications.
Okay, so I mean, chronotypes are actually, like, they are related to indexicality insofar as, I mean, chronotypes and scale were developed from order indexicality. So they are like related concepts. I'd say the major difference is that indexicality doesn't really explain the relationship between how meaning emerges within interaction and how meaning emerges as a product of repeated interaction. So how both of them kind of work together. So order indexicality does this a little bit, but it also like implies a certain linearity between orders. And in reality, according to chronotypic frames theory, the relationship between orders is a lot more flexible. So that means that something from higher order can be brought down to lower order, and something that's lower order can be brought up to higher order. So basically, that means, like, when Blount says, like, you know, when signs of history are converted into signs in history, it's basically saying that when we use linguistic features in interaction, we're drawing on previous use of the features, and that in that sense, we're kind of reproducing kind of historic uses of the forms. But we're also using them in a particular context that generates kind of situationally emergent meanings that are calibrated against these historic uses. And these kind of function together to reproduce a chronotypic frame, which is what kind of configures the expectations of what's going to happen next in discourse and frames the roles of interlocutors in interaction as well. If that makes sense. Happy to clarify further though.
Okay, now the questions are coming thick and fast. So the next one is from David Bradley. If people of different Chinese backgrounds interact, how is it determined whether the Hakka or Jiao Jiao kin terms and pronouns are used?
So that's an interesting question, because generally I'd say there is kind of a lot of sharing of those like resources between the two languages. So although certainly Ket and Teochew are distinct and they're not mutually intelligible, there's a lot of interaction between the communities in Pontianak, which has resulted in kind of like a blurring of the boundaries between the two you know, sets of pronouns and kin terms. And that's resulted in, for instance, there originally was in Kek a different kin term for older sister, but it's disappeared. It's not in use anymore because they've just adopted the Teochew term, so che. Similarly, same things happened with the kinship term for older brother. So although there is a Teochew kinship term for older brother, which is ahia, typically even Teochew speakers will use the Kek term koko, just because it's more common. So based on that, I say, firstly, the distinction between like the sets of kinship terms in Kek and Teochew isn't super clear. But in addition to that, if it's up to like where there are distinct terms in existence, trying to work out like which one you should use in context, people tend to accept both. So that's what I've observed, at least, even if the interaction is all Indonesian medium. So if they don't share the same ethnic language, then you just use whatever kinship terms you have access to indicate that you're familiar with the Chinese kinship system, at least. So yeah, it's not really like a hard and fast rule, at least in my experience, if that makes sense. So I'll just answer David's question.
David Deterding's question, yep. Read it out first so that if people are not seeing they know what the question is, yep.
So David asks, in Malaysia, it's common for English pronouns to be used like I cinta you, Does this occur elsewhere in Indonesia, or is it avoided? Yeah, I don't really see this. I didn't see this very much in Pontianak. I think it is something that happens, like certainly people do use English pronouns, but I didn't really see that happening very much in Pontianak, and maybe that's partly just because the level of English is not very high there. And again, I only really saw it maybe a little bit on social media, but not very frequently. And usually not mixing as well. Okay, and then there's another question. So is there much code mixing going on apart from terms of address? Yes, but that's also complicated. So it's similar to the discussion of like sets of kin terms in Kek and Teochew. Kind of the border between languages isn't always super clear. And this is even the case in terms of the border between Chinese and Indonesian languages. So for instance, there are situations where I played participants like recordings of their interactions and asked what languages they were speaking, expecting to hear something like, oh, I'm speaking a bit of Teochew and a bit of Kek and also a bit of Indonesian, but they'd say things like, oh yeah, that's just Teochew. And I'd be like, you know, but there's these words that I recognize as being clearly Indonesian. That's viewed as like, oh, but typically if you were speaking Teochew, you wouldn't speak like 100% full Teochew unless you're like an older member of the community. So I think maybe mixing is so common to the point at which it's kind of indistinguishable from just speaking monolingually, if that makes sense. Okay, so do you see the same mixture of languages in other linguistic forms like vocabulary and verbal morphology? Yeah, to an extent, I suppose it's the same, similar kind of answer to that question. Yeah, certainly like mixing of languages does happen. I don't know like how aware of mixing people are. Like I said, just because a lot of the time when I thought that mixing was happening, people weren't really labeling it as mixing. And this is in part, I think, because some terms from Indonesian, for instance, have been adopted into Teochew, and the Teochew equivalents, for instance, have just been lost. Yeah, but in terms of verbal morphology, I didn't really see this as much. It was more like particular terms would just be used. So particularly like for some reason, like conjunctions and stuff, that tends to be borrowed quite a lot. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I'm happy to clarify if that's not clear.
Good. Some more questions have come up. Yep. So I think the next one is another one from David Detterding.
So Ket is, so David asks, Ket is Hakka, right? So do they always refer to it with the informal term Ket, or do they refer to it as Hakka? Also, does Hokkien not occur in Pontianak? So yeah, they always use the term Ket. I didn't really hear Hakka. And I think this is because some of the participants I knew did say that like there are other forms of Hakka spoken in other parts of Indonesia, but they're different from the ones that they speak. And so the specific variety of Hakka spoken in Pontianak is referred to as Ket. And Hokkien, no, not really. Didn't see a lot of Hokkien in Pontianak, just Teochew and Ket, as I said. So yeah, there is some Chinese language teaching in Pontianak and at the college as well. So there is actually like a second language class for Mandarin. And it doesn't really impact the students' language choices on campus or at home, just because it's certainly viewed as like Mandarin is viewed as a foreign language in that context, and Teochew and Kek are the local languages. And I think this is partly a result of Kek and Teochew also not being written in Chinese characters. So all the people that were involved in my studies, all the young people that I met, I never met anybody who was literate in Chinese characters who wasn't also studying Mandarin. So they'd learned the Chinese characters from studying Mandarin Putonghua, not from Teochew and Kek. So yeah, I didn't see it really affecting their Chinese language use very much. It's very much viewed as like that's a separate thing. And the reasons that a lot of people gave for like studying Mandarin were basically economic, like, oh, I want to study this because it's good for like business and that kind of thing, not because it related to their identities as Chinese Indonesians.
Well, I think perhaps we're getting close to the end of the talk. I just want to observe one thing, and that is that different to almost every presentation I can remember, where the references are usually printed in tiny type and last up on the screen for all of 10 seconds, we have just had the references on your shared screen for the last 10 minutes, and so we've been able to examine them. And this is almost an innovation, and one of many innovations of the Zoom era. So I'm going to ask you now, however, to unshare the screen. And I will